I am officially recorded. Hit the record button. So what we're going to do now is kind of switch gears a little bit. So basically, this definition is a completed idea, like I mentioned before. So I grouped it, colored it, did whatever. For the sake of ease, I'm going to work in the same file for now, but I'm going to start a new thing. And I'm going to start it at the origin, but I don't want it to conflict with the geometry I just created. So I can do a couple things. I can move the geometry that I created to a different location, or I can turn it off and then create a new definition idea and start something brand new. So for ease and simplicity, I'm just going to take this whole thing and turn it off so that I can start my next idea. So I'll turn it all off. Now I basically have a fresh file. What you can also do, if you care so much that you want to turn this point off, you can put the point on a layer and turn that layer off. And I'll show you how to do that real fast. Under the Layers tab in... Oh, by the way, I just minimized this. So I clicked the minimize button and it just puts it down at the bottom of the screen. So anyway, under layers, I can basically just select the point, and I can go to layer 1, and I'll say change object layer. So now that kind of shows up as like a little reddish dot, and if I click on this light bulb in Rhino, it turns that dot off. Something that's important to note, just for your contextual knowledge, is that even though that point has been turned off, the geometry is still tied to it. So that box that I created that was attached to that point, still attached to that point. It's just on the Rhino side, that point is turned off. And then now on the Grasshopper side, I'm also turning that box off. All right, enough of that. Let's get into actually doing something. So this is going to be your first introduction to lists, which is kind of a programming term in a way. It's the more programming applicable or related component of this software package that I think throws most people for a loop. And it's because the geometry that you create has to be ordered and structured in a way that gives it logic. So anyway, the way we're going to do this is we're going to develop a grid, then we're going to break down that grid into component parts, and then we're going to put geometry in that grid, basically. So to start us off, I'm going to go up to Vector and Grid, and let's just do a square grid for now, keep it simple. Now the grid, it's basically saying it's a 2D grid with square cells. So a square cell obviously is going to have the same size in the X and the Y direction. So the size input, this S, only requires one number. The rectangle one will ask for a size in the X and a size in the Y. But then it's going to ask for a count. In this case, they call it an extent X, which means the number of cells that I want in the X direction. And then the number of cells in the Y direction. And then this plane, right now, world XY, origin, XY orientation, that's all default for it. So these come preloaded with default values as well. The size of the grid cells is a size of 1. The number is 5. So we're just going to populate this with a couple of sliders so that it's malleable. We can change it. So I'll do 0 to 20, 0 less than 20. Hit enter. Copy and paste that 3 times. I'm going to plug it into size, the next one into EX, the next one into EY, and it gave me an error. So why is this an error? Yeah, I can go over it. Sure. Hmm? Yeah. Yeah, because it's 0, right? So you told it that the EX is saying the number of grid cells. So if you say that there are 0 grid cells, then the grid doesn't exist. And so that's an error. Yeah. So I'm going to occasionally pose these questions to you guys because you'll need to practice thinking critically through when these errors happen, because they will happen. They absolutely will happen to you. And if you don't have a process for going through and troubleshooting, then you're going to get hung up on them quite a bit. So anyway, what we have to do is change the size to something that is a real size. Then we need to change the count to something more than 0. We get something like this. So the square grid created this large grid right here. So notice how there are 2 grids. Don't get confused. The small one is your base plane. All that's doing is signifying the plane in which this grid is being generated. Now the big one is the grid itself. And that grid is made up of 2 things right now. It's made up of cells, right? So it says grid cell outlines. And it's we're going to go through this in just a moment, what all this is. And it's made up of points. And that one looks a little bit different. Here's what's important. This is where the structure of information becomes really, really important. I'm going to kind of reference back to this exercise here. And I'm going to drop in a panel. So under param and input, I'm going to put a panel in here. Here's something that's important to know. The panel is used, can be used, to read information. Basically, it allows you to watch the flow of data through these different tools. So if I take like a slider and I plug it into the panel, oops, you're going to see a numerical value show up. That numerical value, obviously, the origin is at 0.0. But there's another 0 over here. We'll get to what that means, but just keep in mind that it's there. So if I move my panel over and I reconnect the point to it instead, what it reads is 0, and then in brackets, 0.0 comma, 0.0 comma, 0.0 comma. So what is that? Right, the x, y, and z coordinates of the point. So it's giving you the data of the geometry that it's housing. And so if I go to the box and I plug this in, it's reading 0 box. So what do you think that 0 is?
The origin?
Nope. Good guess, but no, it's not the origin. I won't torture you with it. I'll tell you. So anyway, let me drop it down here to show you a little better. So that 0 is the first index of a list. And it was 0 in all those cases because the list only had one item. So I don't think that we need to discuss all the minutiae of why programmers decided to use 0 instead of 1 to start their lists. It's all binary stuff. But what you do need to know and like embed in yourself is that in Grasshopper, anytime you have a list of items, the index starts at 0, not 1. So your first item has an index of 0. Okay?
So there's 8 rectangles.
Right. Precisely. There are 8 rectangles there in this list. Now, there are also multiple lists. So these are sets within one giant overall list. If that makes any sense. We're going to get into how to read these here in just a moment. Let's see how we're doing on time on this video. Oh, all right. So I'm going to stop this video here, having identified lists, and then we'll move into visually portraying what a list is, and then we're going to actually start to map things to the geometry within a list.
Okay,
Question?
do that. Can you read through the yellow box?
Yeah. What about it?
Can you show me from the beginning how to get there?
Oh, just how to drop it in?
Yeah.
Okay, so without the yellow box, right? The yellow box is called a panel. Yeah. So under param, under input, drop in this item right here. It's called panel. And all you have to do is just take something and plug it into it, and it'll read what that something is. So I chose the cells, and I plugged them in, and so I realized that my cells are actually rectangles, and they're coming out in packages of 8. Okay?